So, the impossible has almost happened and a Shenmue 3 is coming, hopefully. Which is getting a lot of positive and negative hype, so hey, let's take ourselves a look at what we're dealing with. I am a Sega fan, so might as well talk about something not Sonic related for once. So, Shenmue, whatever.
Shenmue.
So, Shenmue, Yu Suzuki's grand masterpiece. It's a very weird game. I love it, several people do, but it's a bit of a hard sell to explain what it is. It's usually promoted like an enormous epic adventure, which it is, but not in the way games usually are. It's not really an action game because, while there is an excellent free fight mode, you barely spend a percentage of the playtime using it. It's a puzzle game, except the puzzles are very, how to explain, much more realistic and straightforward than usually in puzzle games. Like at some point you need to enter a dark basement, but you don't have a light source to enter. Usually in video games it means you need to travel to a volcano to find a fire staff, or convince a townsperson a couple cities over to give you the matches by doing some dramatic side quest or something. In Shenmue, you get the flashlight by just grabbing one from the cupboard in your house. Oh no, there's no batteries! Now we must use towels to cross the sand so we can oil a man's back to get the map to travel back in time, so we get the butterfly which uses its waves to create a thunderstorm in the present or we just buy batteries from the store with money you earn with a job. Oh. Shenmue's puzzles have a different purpose than puzzles in actual puzzle games. So what are their purpose? What is a Shenmue? Well, a tree, but you know, the game. So, back on the Sega Saturn, Sega's first 3D console, a decision was made to make an RPG about the fighting game Virtua Fighter. Because fighting games usually have these dramatic opening and ending videos to indicate there's some dramatic narrative going on during the games, even though we never see it. So right, makes sense. Make an RPG about Akira, see how he became the kung fu master warrior that he is, and what drives him to compete in these Virtua Fighter tournaments. Now, I'm going off the facts here and talk about my own fantasy assumptions for a bit, so take this with a grain of salt. I'm not sure of this, I never read any official statements, but looking at the story and environmental structure of Shenmue 1 and 2, I always assumed that Shenmue, or Project Berkeley as it was called early on, started as a normal JRPG. Like your typical Final Fantasy, classic Phantasy Star, or whatever. I'd imagine the idea was to have, like, 8 cities on the world map, each with their own dungeon, and our hero travels from town to town, would probably meet a Virtua Fighter character in each town, gets entangled in some kind of local problem, go around dungeon kicking ass, befriending the Virtua Fighter character, and moving on to the next town. So I think at this very early stage, Shenmue would have had the structure of a traditional RPG, except with the Virtua Fighter fighting engine as battle system instead of the usual turn-based stuff. However, as technology became more and more complex, Mr. Suzuki started to get more and more details. What presumably started as your typical Pokemon village towns, just 5 houses in a field with a bunch of lame NPCs walking around, Mr. Suzuki got more and more intrigued with the never-ending potential of 3D graphics on a more powerful system, so he started to make the towns more and more detailed. Looking at the footage of Shenmue when it was still in the Sega Saturn, those who play the games will notice there's even characters and environments from the second and perhaps even third game appearing in the test footage. So at some point, at the very least, the entirety of the first 2 games were in a single Saturn game. Possibly the entire saga would have been in one game, before they started to go into details. But then instead of expanding the game to go over all the story chapters, the focus started to go into adding more and more details into the one town. For whatever reason, Virtua Fighter got dropped from a project and instead only appears as Easter eggs like a series within a series in Shenmue. Now it's all original characters. As I said before in my Sega vs. Nintendo video, unlike Nintendo, and with the obvious exception of Sonic, Sega doesn't feel comfortable promoting their games on the star power of their characters. And, ironically, sell themselves more on gameplay than on familiarity and spectacle. Funny, since within the games it's the other way around. Anyway, the project moved to the Dreamcast, an even more powerful system, so more details and more details were added. Hong Kong and Kowloon were removed from Shenmue and saved up for the sequel, and instead they started to make Yokosuka more detailed. Shenmue even became the poster boy of the potential of the Dreamcast's power and was constantly used at demonstrations as the example of future gaming. So, Yokosuka, a real city in Japan, is the setting of the first game. An enormously zoomed-in version of what in typical RPGs would just be the starting town. Story structurally is almost comparable with a Pokemon opening town. Initial intro to set up the character's main plights, becoming Pokemon Master or avenging father's death. However, the hero can't leave until he first meets a mentor to equip him and give him a destination. That mentor guides the hero to an object that will make him an active participant in the adventure, a Pokemon to start joining the Pokemon Masters, or the mirror that will make Ryo a target for Landias and underlings, and then we leave to the big city where more bigger plot details will be revealed. Well, the starter towns never do this, but other Pokemon towns do. There's a local problem that's mostly unrelated to the main plot, but is our hero's first opportunity to flex his muscles, deal some justice, and start to learn about himself, the world, and earn the respect of his future allies. In this case, having to deal with a gang of thugs at the harbor. The first quote-unquote dungeon of the Shenmue RPG. So that's kinda the story structure of the first Shenmue. To me, a mega zoomed-in version of the opening town and dungeon of an RPG. Although now with your typical RPG action spread so thin, the RPG activities aren't the main focus of the game anymore, and instead we get an entirely new main gameplay activity, the simulation of a city. You'll spend most of the time in Shenmue exploring the city, discovering all the things you can interact with, people to talk to, and learning how the town operates, and what time stores open and business open, and how to get money and how to spend money. It becomes kinda like The Sims, except in the perspective of a participant, instead of a godlike being, and having an actual narrative mission, to find sailors and other comical things in order to solve the mystery of his father's murder. As I said, the main gameplay objectives seem to be like puzzles, finding people or items and solving logic problems. But unlike typical puzzle games, the puzzles aren't there to challenge your brain, they are there to create a bond between the player and the game world. Just being able to ask a guy on the street for directions, or get an important item just from buying it in the store, isn't very taxing on the brain. But it does help to make Shenmue's world feel real. Puzzle games always create a very strong bond with the environments and characters to players, mostly because it's not just a game world you knock around, every item and person has a purpose and requires you to consider and put into a real context where you can manipulate the world to help you on your way. So it becomes more than just backdrops, it's a real environment. But where I usually have a very weird bond with especially point-and-click adventures, mostly because puzzles are always super weird and characters ridiculously incooperative, and the hero never solves any problem in a straightforward logical way, but is always bungling on the edges of sanity, I do have a bond with the world and characters of puzzle games, but usually a bit of an uncomfortable one. I always feel like a scientist observing a herd of strange savage monkeys from a distance, and able to relate and just desperately trying to figure out how their weird little world works. With Shenmue, on the other hand, I'm right beside Rio exploring this town like it's my own hometown. So, a town simulation game. The game balances right on the edge between an exciting action kung fu story and the worship of the mundane. The game lovingly lets you get a soda can from the machine or makes you watch every single individual action of buying an item in the store in intense detail. On one hand, this seems to be a colossal waste of time, but it also creates a unique experience. Because the game hammers down on mundane problems all the time, the adventure elements of the story get a lot more depth. For example, one constant element in the game is going to sleep. When it's nighttime, Ryo gets more sleepy and you need to go home to go to your bed. So in Shenmue 2 we are in a strange land, and we don't have our own bed anymore, so your sleeping place becomes a constant problem. There's a shady and trustworthy place for the desperate, a seedy hotel that costs money and creates a pressure to keep getting more money, and befriending characters can occasionally get you a temporary place to crash so you can finally save up some money. So it's a constant issue playing in your mind. When we later go to the wilderness in Shenmue 2 and we start a 2-day walk through the mountains, that immediately had a weird psychological effect on me. The fear of, but where am I gonna sleep tonight? In normal RPGs or other games, I wouldn't give a damn. Our heroes can just walk around for months on end without sleeping. Watching RPG heroes climb a mountain or walk through the jungle gives me no real sense of skill. It's just an action level for the heroes to go through. So now the mundane suddenly creates a new level of attachment to the situation. The fact that the mountain trip that would have been just an action chase in a different game now makes me worry about small details. This is making the adventure feel more real. And because it takes its time to build up the adventure, it makes the moments where shit really does start to happen feel more intense. The sense and skill and detail make it feel like the biggest and most epic RPG of all. Ironically, by making you worry about stupid mundane problems. Never before had a video game really make me feel like a stranger in a strange land like Shenmue 2. Like you're really trying to figure everything out from scratch and not just running after game missions. This is the strangest part of Shenmue and the main reason why this series is problematic to sell to audiences. It's a game that gets the sense of epicness from the mundane. It's epic not because the variance of environments and the levels of spectacle the action has, but literally in the mundane. Instead of going to the docks to quickly punch the dungeon boss in the face and move on to the next town, here you get a job, create a bond with your coworkers, do investigating, and literally become part of the living and breathing culture of the docks, so that saving it from thugs is more than a mere plot point. It's truly saving a world. Japan has a weird talent that most of us in the West don't. They have a way to romanticize the mundane. Sometimes by making the mundane ridiculously action-packed, but sometimes more subtle. With their love of detail, color use, atmosphere, the right lighting and music playing can make something as boring as just waiting at the station for the train feel like the best moment of your life. A lot of anime always feel to me like they're weird nostalgia trips. Like it's told by an older main character lovingly remembering their favorite memories of the past. Depends on which anime, of course, but you know, the slice of life ones. And Shenmue does that too. If you can get yourself past this weird worship of the boring in everyday life, it makes you get a strange appreciation for the simple things in life, and that in turn makes the bigger moments all the more sweeter. Because, don't get me wrong, while Shenmue is largely a celebration of the mundane, when it does jump into action, it doesn't screw around. There's a fantastic motorcycle kung fu session in the first game, and a wonderful set piece with Ryo and his Han Solo-esque rival Ren chained together and having to escape a gang's hideout like they're in some sort of Jackie Chan movie. There's some pretty good action. Just, you need to work to get to it. But yeah, it's mostly just cutscenes and quick time events. Well, not the first game with quick time events, that would be Dragon's Lair. This was the first big budget game doing it. Out of all the games that have quick time events, this one at least makes the most sense though. Mostly because unlike Resident Evil 4 or God of War, Shenmue isn't a constant action game, so the switch to quick time events isn't as jarring. It almost seems like a logical evolution from the pace and mechanics of the regular game. And second, there's also an added psychological effect. Here, QuickTime events aren't only to create more cinematic action that the regular battle engine can't handle, it's also there to differentiate two different kinds of kung fu action. Instinctive and strategized action. See, whenever Ryo actually knows a confrontation is coming, and he's mentally prepared and has that quiet moment before the fight, where they all have their little stances and all that, then it becomes a free battle. Whenever the action comes unexpected or is in an unstable environment where Ryo can't plan ahead but relies on his instincts, then it becomes a quick time event. So it makes sense. Fighting takes concentration and planning, so when you're chasing or dealing with sudden danger, it's much more about instinctive movements. Especially since the Virtua Fighter engine always felt very methodical to me. Unlike a Tekken or Street Fighter where fighting is much more about quick reactions and speed, Virtua Fighter always plays more like a chess game where you really have to plan deliberate moves ahead. So again, making the free battle system exclusive for deliberate confrontations and QuickTime event for sudden attacks works to the game's psychological favor. So I was explaining Shenmue a year ago to Alex, a friend of mine, who was on the show before and is in the video game development world, and she was laughing at how inefficient and dangerously excessive Shenmue is. Like, you have Kowloon, second city in the second game. You get a rather large chunk of city with several enormous skyscrapers, and you can enter every single building. You can go to every single floor of those skyscrapers. Heck, practically half the doors in these buildings can be opened and the room beyond explored. It's insane. While the Shenmue cities aren't as big as they are in Grand Theft Auto, they are much more detailed and again are fully explorable from the inside. This is an insane waste of resources and energy and computer power. And all seemingly for no reason. There's no Banjo-Kazooie style objectives where you have to find all 200 collectibles in the city and explore every nook and cranny. 90% of the environments you can explore are optional. And usually have no real worth to them. Rarely there's a reward. But again, it's all for the psychological effects. It's a city simulator. And especially the second game is a Lost in a Giant City simulator. You're uncovering a mystery, looking for missing people, finding secrets. If the city is as small as a Pokemon town, it doesn't work. In a city as giant as a Grand Theft Auto city but without any interaction, it feels insincere. You'll just be racing towards the nearest mission marker until you eventually find the next plot coupon. Not in Shenmue. Here it's just you and your little sketchbook. Which is not to say it's super hard to find your way. It's sometimes even ridiculously easy. Just ask the guy on the streets and he'll even walk you to the destination. But it does work for the psychological effect. Being overwhelmed by the enormous amount of options you have strengthens how genuine your quest feels like. Buildings can be entered, people go by their days, a ton of locations and people that look like they're important but aren't still have their own theme song and everything just to keep you guessing. Workers are in the cantina, shopkeepers know about other shopkeepers, temple know where local warriors hang out. It's all connected, all logical. So the way to beat the game is to approach the world like it's the real one and not just a video game mission. It's about access. While the game might feel small-scaled and a bit claustrophobic at times, it's insanely detailed. There's unique items and hidden spaces and background details everywhere. It creates a really unique charm that few other games have. It's the ultimate anti-Nintendo game. Goes against all their sensibilities. Awe, narrative, emotions. It's really a game of its time. It's what I call a pioneer game, as in this is at a time where developers were more awed and inspired by the possibilities of the technology rather than concerned with gameplay mechanics. It's all about selling a dream, to point at the screen and scream, "Look at what you can do! Look at the possibilities!" It has a very strong gameplay engine at its core, but it's stored away and saved for special occasions. Experience first, gameplay later. But yeah, it's weird. A lot of people obviously don't see the point why you want a virtual game experience to emulate things from the real world. And sure, if you do walk around foreign cities for weeks searching for assassins and mastering martial art techniques from Chinese monks on a daily basis, then yeah, I can see why you don't need this game. Please continue your exciting adventures in the real world. But for losers like me, I like it. Little tourist game. Walking around in a detailed representation of Japanese and Chinese cities that I probably never visit, and just soaking up the culture. It's pretty neat. And eventually, it was a financial disaster. It had to be. Not only is it a bit of a hard sell to general masses, but it's insanely expensive to make. The Shenmue games were the most expensive games at the time. 70 million for the 2 games, or one, I'm not quite sure. Every character can be talked to, every cupboard can be opened, almost every building can be entered, most of them having a unique theme song and unique furniture. There's just endless quantities of work and assets burning on the screen. Now, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how big the financial damage was with Shenmue. We know it cost 70 million, but that's including resources for future games, and we don't know how many of those assets created will be reusable for Shenmue 3. Also have no idea how much money the games made. First Shenmue game sold 1.2 million copies. For the second game I have no data at all, both for Dreamcast and Xbox. So yeah, it's hard to say how much this game exactly hit Sega. But whatever it wasn't pretty. Now, games like Grand Theft Auto 5 prove that games with ridiculous access can survive. Grand Theft Auto 5 is in some ways Shenmue's spiritual successor, with the enormous worlds and irrelevant details created for world building, except that Grand Theft Auto 5 is an action game first and has its silly details on second, where Shenmue is all about those details. GTA 5 can survive because it appeals to mass audiences, it has the cars, the guns, the power. Shenmue can't do this. Ryo needs to stay humble and small in his world. He can't be hopping around in cars and punching out enemies left and right. It's a kung fu story at its heart, and that's all about being humble in the face of nature. And being overwhelmed to mundane details is not quite something you can sell to most audiences. So in the past I always thought about how a new Shenmue could ever come to be. I considered the Yakuza series to be the logical evolution of Shenmue. It's also about being in a big city surrounded by cultural details, but it's much more action-packed. Buying things in the store is much more detached and video game-like again. And the game is now packed with random battle encounters, so you won't be wandering around for long without having a healthy amount of people to punch in the face. If they'd retool Shenmue like that, it would be cheaper to produce and easier to sell. And surprise, the Yakuza series has become one of Sega's more successful franchises. But taking away the detail and turning Ryo into an unstoppable fighting machine would go against the spirit and charm of the Shenmue games. So this was the solution to revive Shenmue if you want to get the story finished, and for Sega to at least have a shot at making their money back. But this wouldn't be the Shenmue to actually continue the journey we started on. And to be honest, I don't particularly care for the story itself. It's not super complex or a super interesting story. It is special and epic, but because how it's told in the game, not because of its own literary merits. Shenmue's story needs the proper game in order to have the full impact. This game is one of the best examples of how interactivity can create an entire new way of storytelling. So much so that it's more an interactive experience than a game. Strange coming out of the mind of one of the leading arcade game designers, arcade game being the most pure a game can be. So yeah, the very thing that gives Shenmue its identity and purpose is the exact reason why it's doomed to fail. So, because of that, a real Shenmue 3 is suicide for any company trying to do it. So, I never expected this game, especially a real Shenmue 3, to ever come to fruition. At best I was hoping Sega would go back to the normal JRPG with Virtual Fighter engine concept and would just make a fun action RPG for the 3DS to at least get the story over and done with and have a fun action game on its own merits. But now Sony wants to make a Shenmue 3. Why? Apparently, Sony has done a few contests in the past where it let its fans vote for what games they mostly want to see revived. I can imagine Sony was expecting something like Crash Bandicoot or Parappa the Rapper to win. You know, like, hey, we just grab a random team of developers with nothing to do, throw a couple thousand big ones their way, and we'll make ourselves a nice little action game. It probably won't make as much profit. These series have stopped for a reason after all. But hey, we get nerd cred, have an interesting E3, perhaps might even revive the series if it becomes a success, and it's basically a marketing campaign that has the potential to earn its investment back to some capacity. And a lot of our fans will be happy. So, win-win for everyone. But alas, for Sony. We Sega fans sat together and we were like, we love Sega, they have great games, they have great characters. There's only one thing we don't like about Sega, and that's, well, Sega themselves. So hey, let's get Nintendo and Sony to babysit their franchises for a while we let Sega awkwardly destroy some other sap's poor franchises. So yeah, Yakuza 5 and Shenmue 3 were the big winners from Sony's competition. So after Nintendo took over Bayonetta 2, now Sony's taking care of the Yakuza localization and of Shenmue 3. Sadly, well, Bayonetta 2 didn't do too well. I suppose Nintendo games sell poorly when there's no adorable teddy bears on the cover. And worse, Bayonetta has the audacity to star a female character that isn't a helpless princess or hidden away in manly armor, so it had no chance. And I'm not sure how much of an impact Yakuza 5 will make. These games are a moderate success at best. Sega has very passionate fans, but too little connection with the normal masses. And now, on top of all this, Shenmue 3. Shenmue couldn't make its money back in its golden age where its existence fitted the video game world like a glove, and now that enormously detailed worlds are considered more a burden than a miracle, Shenmue 3 has very unstable legs to stand on. Look, I love Shenmue, and I support Shenmue 3 and back the Kickstarter. And I'll probably love the end result no matter what's gonna happen. But I'm not going to let my love for the game blind me here. Shenmue 3 is very likely to become another financial disaster. This game will be an artistic beauty. I mean, look at his colors. Great, and I will greatly enjoy this game because I have great faith in Mr. Suzuki's gameplay sensibilities and eye for atmosphere. I love his games, practically all of them. It will be a good game for me. Hooray, for us, gamers. But from a business and getting a sequel perspective, the chances of this game becoming a big financial success is tiny. And I think Sony knows this. So, why are they making this game? To make the Shenmue fans happy? Ah, like those soulless businessmen care. Sony put themselves in a corner. For marketing reasons, they made a bold statement that they'd revive whatever small little action game people would want the most. You want a new Ape Escape? Sure. Hey, we listen to our fans and bring back the games you love, even if it's not going to make us very rich. We're practically a charity. Isn't that awesome? Yay, Sony! But oops, those darn fans want a Shenmue 3. Which is worse than a game that is only appealing to a niche group of fans. This is a game only appealing to a niche group of fans that requires the budget of a super AAA mega game. Oops. And again, Shenmue is a pain to market. Mundane, boring life simulator isn't going to get people throwing money at Sony. Selling it as a giant epic action game would be lying, not to mention the Shenmue fans would be suspicious if Sony even understood what the games were about. So instead, they really play up how super really the fans want this game with a Kickstarter. It's a win-win situation for everyone. Sony only has to invest 30 million instead of 33 million bucks because that's a tiny softening of the financial blow. But Shenmue fans get the chance to swoop in and save the day and feel even more proud and heroic of themselves in saving the franchise, even if, realistically speaking, all their money are tiny little drops in the ocean. But it doesn't matter, it's about the principle, man. It's the equivalent of Shenmue fans patting Sony on the back and doing a fist bump. It's not about money, it's about respect. And most importantly, this is real marketing. And now Shenmue is everywhere in the news, breaking records with its super fast money, with the risk of sounding like a negative conspiracy theorist, which I'm not, but somewhere deep inside I secretly suspect Sony to have been funding the Kickstarter themselves a bit, to ensure the record was going to get broken. I mean, this is marketing. No need to worry about how artistic and weird Shenmue is. All the masses need to know that this game is so amazing that it breaks records and how much money it rakes in. No matter how much people will mock how overhyped this game is, now the story isn't so special and the gameplay limited, this record is now making every complaint people have irrelevant. But again, if that's really true and Sony did play around with a Kickstarter, I don't really consider it a problem or betrayal. Sony is in a super dangerous situation with this game. So it makes sense that they try to solve this problem from a weird, creative perspective. Again, me and thousands of other Shenmue fans are more than happy to invest in a project even if it wasn't necessary. Not to mention, I'm surprised that those who invested in the Kickstarters get a PC copy of the game instead of a PlayStation 4 version. Thus, Sony missing out a super easy technique to get over 200,000 people to buy a PlayStation 4 if they hadn't had one yet. So they're not super desperate and ruthless, but do have a weird, strange calm over the whole project. Anyway, making this game is such a cultural event, such a weird and almost unnatural phenomenon. We're seeing a giant corporation literally breaking the laws of financial physics and deliberately support a super expensive game with little to no hope of earning its money out of it, swimming against the tides of capitalism, just in order to fulfill a promise and desperately hope that at least the marketing and reputation they'll earn will be worth it. Because of this strange situation, I'm making this Dissected. Because we need to be honest and transparent on what Shenmue is. I worry that selling it too much like an incredible game with super deep and rich story is overhyping it on the wrong perspective. While the gameplay is great, Yu Suzuki shares Mr. Miyamoto's sensibilities in making movement feel just right, and the story is perfectly functional as a nice RPG kung fu story, but don't go into this expecting the second coming of Christ. It's much more the philosophy of the game that's unique, the strange priorities and its strange respect and love for the mundane, and its great love for details that makes this so special. And this whole Kickstarter thing is really weird. So I understand why skeptics are negative about it, but I understand so and respect what it is and what this means. And really, there's no real victims here. Except, indeed, other Kickstarter projects. After all, this is meant to give small companies and individuals a chance to shine, so watching big companies take away a couple million is unfair. That said, we're not talking about a new Grand Theft Auto or Assassin's Creed here, we're talking about a game whose existence is almost literally impossible. Who could never be, whose creation is like an enormous rock fighting against the eternal and powerful intensive river that is capitalism itself. So with respect to the smaller companies and acknowledgement of their potential loss, we are looking at a very unique cultural and financial phenomenon here. Yeah. So now the Kickstarter has had a powerful start. So powerful that they're starting to become a little cocky again. Yep, Shenmue 4. Yeah. Let's try not to drag Sony in an early grave with that third game first now, shall we? And despite that 4 million is probably the most realistic stretch goal we can hope for with the current speed, they want 10 million for an open world game. To be honest, I kind of prefer having the small chunks of city in the old Shenmue games over a big open world. Shenmue's charm comes over the detail crammed into tiny rooms and streets. I'm not sure a huge, open, Assassin's Creed kind of environment is something I like to see. That would take away from Shenmue's identity. But whatever, I suppose it does help with the immersion. Then again, it seems Shenmue 3 will have a different structure, taking place in tiny Chinese villages rather than a big city, so maybe an open world does make more sense. You can kind of travel along smoothly between them. I don't know, we'll see what happens. Also, I can't help but notice in the stretch goals that they only expand the same village constantly. It's never adding new environments so the story can go further. So, I hope you guys aren't hoping for a thrilling conclusion yet. Oh well, doesn't matter to me though, whether they rush to the finale to get it over with and give me a cool action game, or they still just give us 3 chapters of the dozens we still have to go through, but at least give us a super detailed town to play in. I'll be happy either way. It's Together with Yakuza 5, one of the 2 big Sega games I'm following now in the void of a proper Sonic game. And neither of them have even Sega involved anymore. Hoozah! Can someone just swoop in and take all the franchises from Sega? Poor babies don't know what they're doing anymore anyway. Plutonium, Sumo, someone cool! No, not Nintendo, no!